Hoş geldiniz hepiniz. İnşallah faydalı olacağına inandığımız bir oturum yapacağız. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have our three distinguished guests with us. So great to see you all. Welcome. Marika is the Senior Responsible Investment Manager at a PRI. She's responsible for Nordic Sea and CIS. And she's responsible for engaging with signatories that represent $1.6 trillion of assets under management. Patrick Toby, as we know you. Hi, Patrick. He's been with S&P Global Market Intelligence, and as most of us know, that used to be previously IHS Markit and iPreo. He's been with a company for more than 10 years, servicing clients in the Central and Eastern Europe. And Simon, hi Simon, is a Market Engagement Fellow for the IFRS Foundation. He's also a Senior Technical Advisor to the UN-convened Net Zero Banking Alliance. So please join me in welcoming our guests to this panel. Let's start with Marika. As we are the Investor Relations Society here, we deal with our investors on a day-to-day basis. So we would really like to know, Marika, the landscape for responsible investing and how it's changing. On the one hand, we know that in Europe, in the UK, there has been very aggressive progress. And on the other hand, there seems to be some debate globally. So, we would like to see where we are in terms of the investor expectations, really. For socially responsible investing. If you could please shed some light on that side and especially underline what stands out as the main material issue for us corporates. Is ESG on the way to making the world a better place?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very happy to share some thoughts on that. But first, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and to the organizers for putting this incredible event together. As a very, very brief introduction, so I represent the PRI, which is a membership organization of investors. So we have over 5,300 investors that all work together to kind of achieve PRI's mission of a sustainable financial system. In terms of the specific kind of ESG trends that we're seeing, I would like to highlight three in particular. So the first one is really the kind of change in labeling and definitions that we're seeing, especially in Europe and in the UK. We're also seeing a continued focus on thematic ESG issues themselves. And then lastly, what you alluded to, there is this differentiation in investor roles. But if we go to the kind of first one, which is kind of more labeling, there is no longer the case that you can just kind of put your ESG label on your product and now it is sustainable. We are seeing more of a kind of nuance and focus on it to say, what actually are you doing? What are these funds? So it's a kind of trend that goes for all kind of sustainability issues, is that you now need to say exactly what are you doing and go more into depth. Before we kind of talked about the outflow of capital from ESG funds that we experienced last year. Just to say that has now kind of stabilized, but growth has decelerated from the high top of, was it Q4 2021. Just to kind of say that ESG isn't going away. The material issues are still there. There are loads of externalities that haven't been priced in yet. So what we think of as ESG today may not necessarily be the ESG tomorrow, but it doesn't mean that it's going away. Just kind of a few reasons to the outflows of capital that we saw. I mean, the first one is a kind of obvious one, is the kind of regulatory uncertainty in Europe, and we had the kind of reclassification of sustainability funds, which saw a lot of kind of uncertainty. The other one is kind of the current war in Ukraine, which saw oil price spike, and not surprisingly, loads of sustainable funds are quite kind of underweight when it comes to fossil fuels. So that's another reason. Another one I can think of is kind of rising interest rates, leading especially to kind of fixed income ESG funds that have kind of longer tenor and therefore are a bit more vulnerable to fluctuations when it comes to kind of hedging against interest rates risks. And the last one is also kind of political considerations in the US. But now kind of moving on to the trends that we see in the kind of on the thematic side. Climate, obviously, for all investors, continues to be a key issue of key concern, as also highlighted by COP. But it's no longer the case that they just have net zero plans. Like now investors are looking, do we have interim targets? Do we do climate scenario analysis? We know, for example, that 28% of PRI signatories on the investor sides do climate scenario analysis. So it's really kind of going more in depth. And that, again, is picked up on when it comes to active stewardship and kind of active ownership and stewardship and how they engage with companies. So Climate Action 100+ is this group of investors that engage with the largest 100+ fossil fuel emitters in the world. And they've gone from engaging with the corporates to get a net zero target to actually, can you disclose your decarbonization actions? Can you disclose actively what you're doing? So it's kind of going more into that qualitative assessment. And the same, does your board, do they have the ESG knowledge necessary to actively kind of monitor and manage these kind of ESG risk and opportunities? And then the last thing on the kind of thematic side is biodiversity. After COP15 in Montreal, it is a kind of clear understanding and recognition that a net zero plan without thinking about biodiversity needs to kind of reconsidering. Biodiversity is very much the other side of the climate coin, and there is a kind of key area where loads of externalities aren't really priced in, such as access to natural capital, access to clean water. That is a key for loads of industries. And then on the kind of last trend that I would like to note is just on the kind of changing of investor roles. The investor landscape is now very, very varied, and we're not saying that all PRI signatories are impact investors. Rather, there is a recognition that different investors play a different role, from the ones that kind of look at ESG as a pure kind of risk management strategy, and they are looking at the ESG risks that are there and the ESG risks of tomorrow, to the investors that the kind of on more the universal side that seek to address systemic risks in the financial system by actively trying to affect outcomes, to the more impact investors. And all of these type of different investors have a role to play. And you can't, not every investor is the same or fulfills the same purpose. But on the flip side of that, if you say that you are an investor trying to affect outcomes, we are now asking to show evidence of that. You need to show evidence. You need to disclose the correct kind of information. So those are the kind of few of the key broad trends that we at the PRI are seeing among our kind of signatories. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. For many years, the market has been demanding reporting standards to be implemented for transparency, for comparability, and now that we are seeing a very aggressive rollout on that front, there's a lot of confusion that also comes with it. There's mandatory reporting, voluntary reporting, there's different scopes and times also for implementation. So Simon, if you could please help us walk through IFRS S1 and S2 on that side. What are the implications for the companies?
So thank you very much for that, Ashley. And also, as per what Marika said, thank you very much for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to speak with you. So in terms of the ISSB standards, I think just before I get into answering the question, I just want to explain in, I guess, simple terms, what are the ISSB standards and how it fits with the IFRS Foundation. So to Ashley's point, and we heard it also in the first panel today, where the CEOs, they kept mentioning the importance of sustainability, not just to do the right thing, but because it's a critical data point in decision-making these days. So the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, got created at COP26, so 2 years ago, and is part of the IFRS Foundation. So the IFRS Foundation is the foundation that has published, and been doing it for decades now, the International Accounting Standards Board, So therefore, it is used in hundreds of countries globally, and it's considered as a robust way of disclosing information in comparable, transparent manners. Now, therefore, within the IFRS, there's the International Accounting Standards Board, and now there's the Sustainability Standards Board, which sits next to it. Within that, to date, there's 2 standards that have been published, the ones that, as you mentioned, S1 and S2. I'll try to avoid acronyms today because there's a lot of acronyms in the sustainability landscape, so I'll keep it simple. But basically, S1 is general reporting requirements, so simplifying here, all sustainability topics, and S2 is much more detail on climate specific. So that's kind of the landscape of why where it came from, what, and why it's there. And the bit about responding to the investor demand is really important. So again, I'm repeating what I just said, but what was said in the CEO panel earlier. It is it's not just a nice to have; it's a critical data point in terms of understanding how a company is performing, both in the short term and in the long term. And also, there's other general considerations which are, country specific, but globally also specific in terms of broader sustainability. And we heard on the panel earlier talking about 2050 and those types of timeframes. It's not just about the now; it's also about the future. So these standards were launched. The board was created 2 years ago, and earlier this year the standards were launched. And although you didn't say, as one of the questions we had when we were discussing before was, should companies be panicking right now? And the short answer is no, they shouldn't be panicking, because the way that the standards have been created, we're not looking to reinvent the wheel. So it's very much based on standards that were already out there before. So again, I said I wouldn't mention acronyms, so I'm only going to mention one name rather than all of the different initiatives that have existed for a few decades. But the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is something that many investors will have come across and many companies are using already. The same types of principles apply here. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to ensure that the information which is disclosed by the companies is usable by the investors, and it's useful in terms of making decisions. So it's using approaches that were already there, bringing it together, and then ultimately trying to make sure that in different regions, countries around the world, the same way of disclosing the information is done. To that effect, there's a key word that you may have, if you read reports about sustainability, you may have come across the word interoperability. That basically means to make sure that what is being used, if it's in Turkey, if it's in Europe, if it's in Asia, if it's in North America, in Africa, wherever, it's the same language that is being used. It doesn't mean that every country has to do the same thing. Ultimately, every jurisdiction is sovereign of its decisions. So, and that's an important point. The ISSB, it's a voluntary initiative, as it stands. It's not mandatory. So we'll talk about the European standards. I think Toby will talk about it just afterwards. Those, when they come in, and I'm sending the bad potato your way, those are the mandatory things. As it stands right now, the international, and jurisdictions may decide to mandate the use of the ISSB. That's up to each region or country to do so, but it's a voluntary standard. And the idea is that it works with the other standards that exist. So it's not us versus them, ISSB or ESRS or something elsewhere. It's just making sure that it's the same language which is being used for a specific subset of questions, for a subset of stakeholders, so within this broader kind of disclosure element, is the same starting point here and elsewhere around the world. In terms of the timelines and the when companies may need to start using them, so here again, as I was saying, it's a voluntary standard as it stands. So they were launched 6 months, they were officially finalized through all the usual robust IFRS processes. There were 1,400 responses to the consultation, and you can imagine a response is not just a yes/no, it's paragraphs and pages of information, so super, super robust, market-led exercise with obviously technical expertise in it. And then 6 months ago, the standards were launched. They are applicable as of January, so in 3 weeks' time. Companies are encouraged to start using them voluntarily if they want to, but from a mandatory perspective, this depends on when jurisdictions decide to mandate its use. I obviously cannot say it will happen, but what I can say is in terms of the signals we're seeing from within the world right now in terms of that it's likely it probably will happen. And part of that is the fact that IOSCO has given a letter, or has published an endorsement of the standards to basically say that they fulfill the needs of the investor community and all of the other, I guess, mission points that the IFRS set out originally. So there's a very, very strong support from the industry, from different regulatory I guess, bodies about the quality of the standards. So if there are companies, in the room here today, in terms of who are thinking, or preparers who are thinking about using them, all I can say is that the standards are published. I would heavily encourage to start looking at them, not only because they may come in later from a mandatory perspective, but also because the principles that have been put in them are based on what is being done as leading practice essentially around the world in a, again, decision useful manner, and therefore it can only be beneficial to the, I guess, the wider relationships that you have between the companies and the investors in terms of providing the whole story about what you're doing. And I think I'll stop here because I have a few other points, but I'll come back to it afterwards.
Thank you, Simon. So it looks like we don't need to panic on that side just yet. No. Let's see if there's anything else we should panic about. Toby, on the mandatory side, there's the CSRD, which is actually for European companies, but because Turkey is doing a lot of business with the EU, how does that actually impact Turkish companies? Are we good corporate citizens? Should we do more? How does it look on that side?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much. I think this is now the 10th time that I'm attending the conference, so it's always great to be back towards the end of the year, and I can tell you it's a highlight of the year to be here, so thank you very much for that. Yeah, to come to your question, of course, I don't know what it is for you, but I hear a lot of different standards, and there's like multiple standards being mentioned, and that makes it very confusing. And this is something that we have been asked to do, is we have been asked to collect the data so that it is comparable for the investors. And at the end of the day, it is, I was glad to hear that you said 1,400 data points. I think we only look at 1,000, so it's much easier. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I was saying that there's 1,400 responses to the consultation. There's far, far fewer data points. And actually,
okay.
You're bringing me forward, so sorry, I'll jump in at this point, but it is important to correct. The way that the ISSB standards were created, there's two principles which underpin it. And I'm sorry, I kind of have to bounce against you here, but there's the cost effectiveness both for the preparer and the decision usefulness for the investor. So in terms of there are, a reasonable number of industry-wide KPIs and metrics that need to be disclosed around emissions and the like. But in terms of industry-specific disclosures, there's on average, so it builds initially on a previous standard. I'm going to skip the acronym now, but previous standard that existed, which was industry-specific. There's 77 different industries within it, so very specific types of metrics. And on average, sorry, because there's 1,000 coming over here, there's only 13, that's 13 metrics that need to be disclosed per industry. So it's very, very specific and based on decision usefulness to make sure that from a time constraint, it is very, very, decision useful. So I'll let you bounce back now.
Thank you very much for destroying my case here. So what I was trying to say is, we've been asked to somehow collect the data and make it comparable. And we are following a simple or a similar methodology to have different schemes. I think it's 46 different schemes, and then the data points behind it. And it's based on an analysis from RobecoSAM. And Asli asked me to take a look at the data that we already have in our system, how the Turkish companies are responding. Are they a survey respondent, or are we collecting public data? Because that is the two ways for us to collect the data. So on the one hand side, we look what's publicly available and put it into our data sets. And that typically results in less disclosure, or there are survey respondents that give us the data, work with us to have as much comprehensive data in CapIQ Pro And I must say that I looked at a fair amount of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say names, I skipped that, but you know, there were a couple of companies and they got a score 60 versus the industry standard of 40, or 72 versus the industry standard of 35. So really, really good results, and which is a clear signal that Turkish companies are disclosing very thoroughly around ESG, which is great. Big kudos to everybody here. I really had to look for one company that was not a survey respondent, and there you can see the result already, only 29 versus the industry standard of 32. So it definitely is worth delivering that data, because that data is then again used by institutional investors. It's used by a number of people that take that data to make a responsible investment. And of course, then if you want to dig in a little bit deeper and want to have a comparison, all of that is possible, but that's maybe not the point quite here.
Well, we can take that up individually in the breaks and everything, right? Okay. So, Marika, first of all, is there anything you would like to add on CSRD? And after that, if you could please also talk about the upcoming proposal, which is the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that might have an impact on Turkish companies. Because again, we are a very important manufacturing hub for the EU, and as far as I know, this is something that's related to the supply chains, right?
Yes, absolutely. So very happy to comment on that. Would also like to echo what Toby just said and say that kind of corporate governance is very much at the center of all of these discussions. So it's very kind of one of the kind of key pillars. And what investors are looking for, they're not looking for the kind of perfect, sustainable company. They're looking for a company that has the corporate structures in place where they can actually have a meaningful dialogue, affect change. So just kind of important to bear that in mind. Also on the CSRD, you're not alone on the corporate side. Investors have to do their own sustainability reporting in the European Union. So on the investment manager side or asset management side in Europe, the main regulation is the SFDR, so the Sustainable Finance Financial Disclosure Regulation, and the associated principle of adverse impact statements. So essentially, in a nutshell, this is a very kind of high-level summary. But if you're an investor in the European Union and you want to market your fund as sustainable, there are certain criteria that need to be met. So the first one is really that the fund, the product, needs to have kind of contribute to a sustainable or environmental objective. It also needs to do no significant harm, and that is kind of measured through the principle of adverse impact indicators. And also, the investee company needs to kind of follow good corporate practice. Depending then, the level of disclosure is slightly different depending on the objective of your fund and how sustainable it is. But just to say that the investors, they rely on the corporates to provide them with the information they need in order to market their fund as sustainable or not sustainable in the European Union. In particular, on the principle of adverse impact, which if you kind of go back is the kind of second criteria to market your fund, investors need to identify adverse impact and how they can kind of mitigate against that. There are several adverse impacts they need to do, such as greenhouse gas emissions, the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions, board gender diversity, for example. So they kind of are spread various kind of categories from climate, social, biodiversity. And the investors are going to come to the corporates and say, we need this information. And they are going to use the CSRD, those two kind of European regulations, they're intended to fit together. They are part of the taxonomy. They both contribute to the goals of the European Union. So they are going to look at the CSRD and disclosures from that and take that data and use that in their own reporting. So just a bit of a kind of flavor from what is happening on the investor side. Also going to mention very, very briefly the CSDDD, which is actually going to trilogues at the moment, and it will be finalized tomorrow on Wednesday, and the law is expected to come into place in next spring. And it's really kind of setting out the due diligence requirements for environmental factors and human rights. So all corporates operating, both non-financial and financial operating entities operating in the EU will have to comply with the CSDDD. And it's likely to affect supply chains as well. So if you're an entity, a financial or non-financial entity in the EU, you will have to report and disclose on environmental and human rights issues in your supply chain. So this is obviously a kind of groundbreaking kind of results when it comes to supply chains for all European corporates. It's too early to kind of tell the exact scope and the consequences of this, but I mean, one likely thing is kind of bringing the supply chains closer to the end markets. So I guess in a very kind of brief summary of everything I've just said is just to kind of be aware of the fact that you are likely to see more questions asking about disclosures when it comes to both human rights, environmental factors, as well as the principle of adverse impact, all those issues. So it's kind of long list of kind of data that investors now need. And just to bear in mind that it will be a combination of third-party data sets, as well as active information from the corporates that investors will actively try to seek out to meet their own obligations and their own disclosure requirements.
Thank you. It's yet another development that will bring more sustainability-related questions into the IR agenda. Okay. Simon, we need your help on another point. On materiality, we would really like to know the importance of these disclosures from the user's perspective. Is it just another compliance exercise? Is it going to be useful in terms of demonstrating how robust our businesses are and really decoupling ourselves from the competition, maybe, let's say? So how do we generate added value?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And to answer the first question, is it about compliance? No, as I was saying earlier, it's not about compliance right now in terms of the ISSB standards. It's very much about the investor dialogue and creating a robust narrative around what is happening within a company. And I think, and I'll come back to afterwards in terms of the so what, but I mean that kind of answers all of the questions around why disclose, or all of the questions, why does one disclose ultimately to the investors? But I think one point which I just want to make, which is important, and obviously I'm toying with Toby and going back and forward between the ISSB standards and the CSRD and whatnot, but I think what is really important to remember is, what is the purpose of the different standards? And the CSRD and the wider European, regulatory packages that come out are answering a policy drive, and therefore it's looking to answer a number of questions for a number of different stakeholders, whether that's the investors, the regulators, civil society, and so forth. And that is, it's good, it's right, it's the right thing to do because it has those objectives. Within that, there's a subpart, and that's the bit that the ISSB looks at. So really imagine a big box, and then a small box within that is the ISSB element, which looks at a subset of questions for, in particular, the investor angle here in terms of the mid-long-term, materiality of sustainability topics. And I'm saying that in terms of, saying this is the subset, the smaller box, because there is, this kind of historical misunderstanding that there's one box here, ISSB, one box there, and they'll be fighting away. And it's absolutely not that. It's a smaller part, within it. And so in terms of the, why does one disclose? What is the, obviously I'm speaking to a room of experts who do the disclosure and answer it all day, so I'm not going to, pretend that I've, got the knowledge to properly answer that question. But, in terms of the added value, which was the point in terms of where is it going to. At the end of the day, this is about making sure that the information that is being published is understandable, comparable, for the investor in this specific frame that I'm saying it, and that they're able not only to compare to another peer within Turkey, but also that they'll be able to compare to another peer within Europe, within Asia, or within anywhere in the world. And that is the bit which is important, because there are, of course, jurisdiction-specific elements, and that is where the countries, the governments, the policymakers, they will come in and say, in Turkey, this specific metric, everyone has to disclose it because it's really important for policy reasons here. However, globally, there's these other metrics that need to be disclosed, and because in this industry, this is what creates, this is what has an impact in terms of the short-term, mid-term, and long-term from a sustainability perspective. And ultimately, with that information, we heard it earlier again. Actually, I think both my peers here mentioned it, but also, when the CEOs were speaking about, the links to Europe being the biggest market. If investors are looking at companies in Turkey on these topics and aren't able to compare that information to European companies or other actors who are within Europe, it's going to be very difficult to make a decision. So that is the kind of the goal here. It's really making sure that the information, as per any, I guess, traditional accounting standards, it's making sure that the information is understandable, comparable, and transparent. And there are other bits obviously within that. So I think that kind of adds, within the added value, there's always the bits around making sure that one tells their story, and that has positive consequences in terms of building trust and all of those elements. But here, really, in terms of the the international element, the global baseline element of it, it really is about ensuring that there's this comparable information between different regions and different jurisdictions.
Thank you. And Toby, I would like to get your views on the significance of corporate disclosures from the perspective of data solutions and ESG scoring mechanisms. How important are they, and how are they used when it comes to ESG indices and scoring?
Okay, well, I answered bits and pieces of that already in my first reply, but of course, the data that is being collected is then flows into numerous indices like the S&P sustainability index, etc. And that's at the end of the day, that's what the IR departments are monitoring and have to monitor, where they are in the ranking there. And sometimes it's not even whether you do something differently, but if somebody else does something better than you, you might be pushed out of the index. So that is something to pay attention to. And again, I don't want to mention names, but there is another big index that has been used in the past, and we hear from investors that it's been less relevant because it's not as what you just described as sort of cut up into pieces and comparable. It's more like all seen through one point of view, and that does not reflect really how companies could or should be repaired. Just if you imagine a software company versus an oil producer, it's very difficult to compare, and this is why we, for example, follow different principles. But I'd love to come back to the CSRD, as you just mentioned it, and what I've hear from companies, especially outside the EU. I think within the EU, it is already, people are preparing for it with, well, mixed results, let's put it this way, because it is quite a challenge. But what we have seen is that companies from outside the EU realize that they are actually obliged to disclose based on CSRD. And I don't know if that slides I put together is available.
Slide tekrar yapabilir misiniz?
Yeah, so without going into details and killing you with too much data, but this is what is required, or where you can see as of when a company needs to disclose data based on CSRD. And when I first saw this, I mean, I had always heard about CSRD, but when I first saw this, I realized how low the thresholds are. And we've seen a couple of companies who are, based outside of Europe, and they realize that they have subsidiaries that actually have to have to comply with these standards going forward, and doing that in a very soon manner. If you look at the dates here, that is not too far off. So that is something that needs to be paid attention to. And then, there's different phases to it, where at the first phase you assess what it is you need to report, but then what is at least as important is you have to have very solid procedures to collect the data and produce the data, and do that on an ongoing basis, because that is not a one-time effort, it's an ongoing effort. So it will not go away, it will just go deeper and deeper and deeper going forward. And I think that was also part of the discussion we had, or actually no discussion, agreement rather, that we said it will not go away. It has to be established. And a question that I often got is like, but this and this is not relevant for us. That is true, but then you have to have an opinion about it. So you have to say, like, this is not relevant, we will not report on it. But just ignoring it will result in less favorable results. So that is one of the important things. You should have procedures, how to define the data, find the data, report the data, and you should make sure that it is constant, so that the criteria do not change, and it should be as transparent as possible how you go about and how you get that data. So maybe that's the key impact for CSRD, and I can only emphasize the point again. CSRD is something that will come pretty soon, and it has to be paid attention to it, and rather now, because there's another aspect which we briefly touched upon, that there aren't that many people around who can actually do this. So you need to find the people or educate the people to do it.
Indeed, this is yet another challenge.
That is a different, that's more a footnote, yes.
Exactly. Let's talk about that later. But at the end of the day, it's good that there's all these developments, and Europe's actually tagging us along. And this is actually, as long as it's used by companies to progress and to manage their risks, it really is going to make a difference. Because as we are seeing every day, it's becoming more and more visible to us every day from every side that we need to continue to work on sustainability. The dynamics are shifting quicker than we initially expected. And certainly, it's not enough that you are moving along. If everybody's going faster, you will still be left behind.
That's a very important point, yes.
So we're doing really good as far as the timing goes. Before we conclude the panel, and thank you for all of the very valuable information, I would like the audience to take away a key message. So please, can I ask each of you to share one single key message for our audience?
Ladies first.
Ah, excellent. I think my key one would be, policy activity and regulation has just started. There are a lot of externalities that have not been priced in yet, especially when it comes to natural capital. And it is something to be aware of. It is more than simply a risk management strategy. A lot is changing, and policy is likely to pick up even more than we've seen already. And what's happening in the EU is very much only the start of a very long ESG or sustainability journey. So very much it is changing. It will look very, very different in a few years to come. But there are a lot of things that haven't been taken into account yet.
Me next. So actually, I just want to bounce off one thing Toby said before I'll come up with my concluding remark. But I think the last point that Toby said about the resources and the fact that it takes time, I think is really important. I'm sure you're aware of it, but whereas maybe hypothetically 10 years ago when people disclosed ESG data or whichever acronym they want to use, people looked at it, but it was a nice kind of thing, and whether it was right or wrong mattered, but not that much. It was kind of pushed to one side. Now the way things are going, maybe this can be my final point, but in terms of the importance of the data and the materiality is just accelerated on a year-by-year basis. I mean, I've been in the field for about 15 years, and even, what are we, 2023? Even 5-6 years ago, to have a conversation with the finance department of a company was very, very difficult. They're just like, sustainability team. Now most of the chief sustainability officers sit within these finance teams. And linked to that, of course, it means that the businesses that are integrating this within their business models, they're making it a strategic point and something which really matters. It's not just a nice topic that they do to be a nice company. But linked to that, and this is the bit which comes back to the resources element, it means that any information which is considered to be material from a decision-making perspective, whether it's in the short term or in the mid-term, is going to need to be assured by external parties, is going to need to be, is going to need to pass that assurance, and therefore means that within the organizations, people need to be trained up to be able to do that exercise. So that's why, earlier I was saying that the ISSB standards, they're voluntary. It's voluntary to use them, excuse me, from the 1st of January onwards, but I would kind of encourage any organization, whether it's on the preparer side or on the user side, to really start looking into this, because it's only going to keep accelerating in terms of the integration of these data points in decision-making processes, and the quality that's going to be expected of these points is going to keep increasing, to the point where, it should be the case already, but the level of robustness that's going to be required is going to be identical to what is required from a financial, what is traditionally called from a financial data perspective. So it's a positive warning rather than a bad warning. But it's a positive warning of the importance of really starting soon on this topic if it hasn't already been done, and then of course engaging, the investors working with the companies, but from the companies also, transparently starting these conversations with the investors to understand what are the data points that matter to them, how do they want to receive that information, and so forth.
I agree with you, and that actually echoes very much what we've seen with most of our clients, where they said, if you haven't done this before, it's extremely difficult, whereas, when we come in and do it with them, then it makes a major difference, and then, once it is established, it's easier to maintain, a lot easier to maintain it. And I saw a presentation about the topic of manpower a couple of weeks ago, where big companies said we have 1 or 2 people, and that is just not possible. And so, as a side note, I think that it will become quite a relevant factor. Outside of that, I think across the globe, the data has to be compared, and that is the main challenge. It's a lot easier when it's about financial results, but nevertheless it has to be done, and disclosing the data and making it available makes it easier, because that is one thing that I can assure. If the data is not there, it's constructed, if that makes sense. So we will model what the reply will be, and that is most of the time far less favorable than the actual disclosure. But I think I'm preaching to the converted here.
Well, we're just on time. Thank you very, very much for your contribution and for flying all the way here to be with us today. Umarım faydalı olmuştur. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you.